Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hi, I'm Oliver.
Hi, I'm Mully.
Welcome to Science in Easy English. What if you could hear colors?
Yeah, it's one of those questions that sounds like pure science fiction, right?
It really does. But I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine if the everyday sound of an elevator bell didn't just register as a normal ding in your ears,
Okay.
but instead it suddenly burst into this brilliant, vivid magenta right in front of your eyes. Or imagine if the days of the week had specific, undeniable
Like
colors.
Tuesday is just definitively silver gray.
Yes, exactly. And there is no arguing it. We aren't talking about a fun metaphor here or, an artist just having a really active imagination. This is a neurologically proven reality that people live with every single day.
It's just wild to think about.
It is. And for this deep dive, we're taking a massive stack of sources like neuropsychological case studies, historical accounts from legendary artists, and even cutting-edge genetic research to really explore the reality of synesthesia.
Which is awesome because it fundamentally challenges how we assume the human brain constructs the world around us.
Yeah.
I mean, we tend to think of our five senses as completely isolated data streams.
Right, like totally separate highways.
Exactly. Five separate highways bringing information into the brain. Sight goes to the visual cortex, sound goes to the auditory cortex, and so on. But what we're looking at today is what happens when those sensory highways actually intersect.
But before we jump into how people actually hear colors, we need to establish exactly what synesthesia is, and I guess what it isn't.
Yeah, that's super important.
So the word itself comes from Greek, meaning joined sensation. Essentially, stimulating one sensory pathway automatically triggers an involuntary experience in a completely different one.
And we really need to debunk a major myth right out of the gate here. For decades, the general public, and honestly, even a lot of doctors, thought this was incredibly rare.
Oh, totally. Like a 1 in a million medical quirk.
Right. But current estimates show that about 4% of the global population has some form of it. Some researchers even put it as high as 1 in 24 people.
Wait, really? 1 in 24? If it's that common, how is it possible that people don't know they have it?
Well, because a lot of people who have it simply don't realize their perception is unique.
Hmm.
I mean, if you've spent your entire life seeing the number 4 as chestnut brown, or like tasting strawberries whenever you hear the word sunshine, you don't question it. You just assume everyone experiences the world exactly that
It
way.
makes sense.
It isn't until a casual conversation happens,
Mm-hmm.
maybe they mention that a song looks a little too yellow, and their friends look at them like they have two heads, that's when they realize they process the world differently.
Right. And there is a researcher and artist named C.C. Hart who outlined some major misconceptions about this condition. She emphasized that synesthesia is not a disease.
Definitely not.
It's not a mental disorder. And crucially, it is not some 24/7 hallucinatory drug trip. It is a highly consistent, stable neurological trait.
And that consistency is the absolute hallmark of the condition. In fact, neurologist Dr. David Eagleman actually developed something called the synesthesia battery test to prove exactly that.
Right, because you can't just take someone's word for it.
Exactly. He recognized you have to physically measure the permanence of their experience
But how do you even measure something that only happens inside someone's head?
by testing their memory against their perception. So, on the battery test, a user is presented with a digital color picker. One of those wheels with millions of possible hexadecimal color codes.
Oh, yeah, like in Photoshop.
Right. They are asked to select the exact shade of color they associate with a list of words, letters, or numbers.
Okay.
Now, if you ask a non-synesthete to do this and then retest them completely out of the blue a few months later, their answers will only match about 20 to 30% of the time.
Because they're just guessing from memory.
Exactly. But a synesthete, they will match the exact precise color codes 70 to 90% of the time, even years later. They aren't memorizing it. They're actually perceiving it.
Wow. That just makes it so incredibly visceral. There is this famous case study from Dr. Richard Cytowic where a man at a dinner party suddenly complained, waiter, this chicken doesn't have enough points.
I love that quote.
It's so good. And he wasn't trying to be funny. He actually experienced a sharp, geometric, physical shape in his hands and mouth when he tasted a specific flavor. The recipe was just slightly off, so the geometry of the flavor wasn't pointy enough.
That is just wild to think about.
Okay, let's unpack this. Think of the brain like a massive control board in a theater.
Okay, I'm with you.
Normally, pushing the audio slider brings up the sound, and a completely separate lighting slider brings up the stage lights. Synesthesia is essentially having a crossed wire inside that control board.
Right.
You hit the heavy bass pedal for the audio, and the electrical current automatically, uncontrollably bleeds over and fires off the red stage lights.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. And we know this isn't just psychological either. Functional MRI scans, which track blood flow in the brain to measure cellular activity, have actually mapped this out.
So you can literally see it happening.
Yes, it's explained by what's called the cross-activation theory. When you put a synesthete in an fMRI machine and play a sound, you don't just see the auditory cortex light up, you see a simultaneous surge of blood flow in the visual cortex.
Specifically the V4 area.
Exactly, the V4 area, which processes color. An electrical signal meant for one sensory region literally activates another at the exact same time.
Which brings us to the most famous manifestation of this cross-wiring chromesthesia, or sound-to-color synesthesia. Sounds evoke colors, shapes, and movements, and it has secretly shaped some of the world's greatest music.
It really has.
But how a musician experiences this isn't the same across the board, is it?
No, it's not. The rendering of this data usually falls into two distinct categories. You have projectors who actually see the colors out in external physical space.
Like floating in front of them.
Exactly. If a car honks, they might see a jagged flash of orange floating a few feet in front of their eyes. It's almost like an augmented reality overlay on the real world.
That's incredible.
And then you have associators who experience the colors intensely, but entirely in their mind's eye.
Right. And while the specific colors vary wildly from person to person, like your color for a piano C chord might be sky blue while mine is forest green, the research points to some fascinating universal rules.
Yeah, the patterns are really interesting.
Across the board, high-pitched sounds almost always elicit lighter, brighter colors. Low-pitched sounds elicit darker, heavier colors. And when you look at how legendary musicians utilize this, it starts to make sense of their entire creative process.
Oh, absolutely.
Billy Joel, for instance, connects colors directly to his lyrics. Vowel sounds like an A, E, or I produce calming blues and greens for him. But hard consonants, like a sharp T or a P, flare up in his mind as red or gold.
You also see it in Stevie Wonder. I mean, he's been blind since shortly after birth, yet he actively uses his chromesthesia to describe notes as colors.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he uses these mental spatial color patterns to create and structure his melodies. He is essentially working with a visual palette of sound to compose music.
That is amazing. Pharrell Williams uses it as a diagnostic tool. When he's producing a track, he uses his internal colors to check if a song is in the right key.
That's so cool.
If he looks at the visual representation of the track in his mind and the colors clash or look muddy, he knows the musical key is mathematically wrong. It is literally a visual equalizer built into his brain.
Wow.
Even going back to the 19th century, the composer Franz Liszt used to thoroughly confuse his orchestra by demanding they play a little bluer or not so rose.
Oh, I bet they loved that.
Right. The musicians just thought he was being an eccentric genius, but he was literally describing the visual feedback his brain was demanding to see.
And it's vital to note the deep emotional connection here, too. Colors naturally trigger moods for all of us. But for a chromesthete, the emotional impact of a song is exponentially multiplied by the visual data.
That makes total sense.
Think about the physical and visual difference between a heavy dubstep track and, like, smooth ambient jazz. A dubstep track with aggressive sawtooth synthesizers and sudden bass drops forces the brain to render extreme, flashing, high-contrast visual explosions.
It sounds exhausting, honestly.
It's incredibly stimulating. Contrast that with jazz, which might produce a soothing, slow-moving wash of translucent indigo or cool blues.
Okay, but wait, here's where it gets really interesting. I hear about Friends List asking for a bluer sound, or Billy Joel painting with his vowels, and my first thought is, isn't this just a highly creative artist being poetic?
Right, that's what a lot of people think.
Aren't they just speaking in metaphors to explain abstract musical concepts?
It is a completely natural assumption to make. But what's fascinating here is the permanence and the involuntary nature of the condition. It is absolutely not a creative choice.
They can't just turn it off.
No, they can't. If you take a hallucinogenic drug like the French writer Théophile Gautier did in 1845 when he famously wrote about experiencing green and red sounds while eating hashish, you are chemically, temporarily lowering the barriers between those sensory highways.
Right, you're temporarily flooding the control board.
Exactly. But congenital chromaesthesia is entirely different. It is a fixed, lifelong architectural feature of the brain. They cannot turn it off, and they cannot choose the colors. It is as involuntary as your pupil dilating when a bright light hits your eye.
But if it's a fixed architectural feature that you can never turn off, that sounds like a severe burden. Imagine trying to read a complicated book while someone is aggressively shining a flashlight directly into your eyes to the beat of the music playing in the apartment next door.
You've hit on the exact reason why we have to explore the dark side of a colorful mind. Because the brain is constantly double processing information, noisy or chaotic environments can lead to intense sensory overload and extreme mental fatigue.
I can't even imagine.
It takes a massive amount of cognitive energy for the brain to constantly render all that extra visual or tactile data. Because of this, clinical studies show that synesthesia is actually linked to much higher rates of anxiety and even PTSD.
Wow.
The world can simply be too loud, too bright, and just too much to handle.
There is an amazing case study of a musician referred to as AP. This person has both chromesthesia and absolute pitch. AP absolutely hates rap music.
Oh, yeah.
But because rap music has rhythmic and tonal elements, AP's brain involuntarily triggers colorful visual flashes, known as photisms, every single time a rap song plays.
Which is so frustrating for them.
Exactly. It infuriates AP because their brain is automatically validating the rap as music by rendering the beautiful colors, completely against their conscious personal taste.
It really highlights how little control they have over the physiological response. I mean, how would you handle trying to hold a conversation in a coffee shop if every time the espresso machine hissed, you tasted copper?
Honestly, I would probably never leave my house.
Exactly. And that is a real reality for some people. There is a Swiss musician in the clinical literature, identified as ES, who doesn't just see music, she actually tastes it.
That is wild.
For her, a minor second musical interval literally tastes sour on her tongue. A major second is bitter. A perfect fourth tastes exactly like fresh mown grass.
Cooked grass.
Yeah. Imagine the sensory distraction of tasting lawn clippings every single time someone plays a specific chord on a piano.
Or take mirror touch synesthesia, which sounds like one of the most overwhelming variations out there. This is a kind of supercharged neurological empathy.
Intense.
If a person with mirror touch sees someone else being touched or harmed, their brain fires the exact same tactile receptors, making them feel a physical sensation in their own body.
Wow.
One of the case studies detailed a woman who literally gags and chokes if she is in the room watching someone else eat. Another case involved a neurologist who felt intense, crushing pressure in his own chest while he was watching a patient receive CPR.
Well, understand why the brain does this to itself. We have to look at early childhood development and how it relates to broader neurodivergence. Synesthesia actually has a high prevalence link with autism.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Both conditions are characterized by what neuroscientists call hyperconnectivity in the brain. When we are infants, our brains are highly interconnected. Essentially, every sensory region is wired to every other region.
Like everything is plugged into everything else.
Right. The visual cortex talks to the auditory cortex. The tactile regions talk to the taste receptors. It's just a chaotic web of data.
Wait, so you're saying a baby's brain is basically a giant tangled ball of sensory yarn, and growing up is just cutting the
That
string.
is exactly what happens. It's a biological process called synaptic pruning. As a child interacts with the world, the brain realizes it doesn't need to taste shapes or hear colors, so it prunes away those unnecessary connections to streamline our neural pathways.
Making processing more efficient.
Exactly. But in people with synesthesia, and often in individuals with autism, that synaptic pruning doesn't happen to the same degree. Those early neurological bridges between the senses are just left intact.
But if this lack of pruning causes so much sensory overload and fatigue, why didn't human evolution weed it out? Why does the brain keep these strings tangled in some people?
Because the instructions are written into our DNA. The genetic root of this trait is finally becoming much clearer to science. Researchers have mapped the DNA of multiple families who pass down sound to color synesthesia, and they found rare variants in what are called axonogenesis genes.
Axonogenesis.
Yeah, axons are essentially the long transmission cables of a neuron. Axonogenesis is the process of those cables growing, extending, and finding their targets in the developing brain. Researchers have pinpointed these specific genetic variants spanning across chromosomes 2 and 6.
So it's hard-coded.
It's literally a localized genetic instruction manual telling the brain to keep those sensory highways merged.
But the wild thing is, even without those specific genetic variants on chromosomes 2 and 6, we all have a tiny bit of this cross-wiring left over.
Oh, for sure.
Even if you don't have synesthesia, your brain still inherently maps audio to visual concepts. Think about the noise spectrum. We intuitively accept the concept of white noise, the static sound on an old TV.
Right. Everyone knows white noise.
We call it white noise because it mixes all sound frequencies together exactly the same way white light is a mathematical mixture of all visual frequencies. Or pink noise, which sounds like a soothing, rushing waterfall. It literally matches the high and low frequency distribution of pink light. Our brains naturally want to pair sound and light together.
And that underlying universal capacity for cross-sensory mapping has led to some of the most groundbreaking work in neuroscience today. Have you heard of sensory substitution devices, or SSDs?
A little bit, yeah.
Pioneers like Paul Baccarita and Peter Meisner looked at the synesthetic brain and realized something profound. If a synesthetic brain can naturally turn sound into sight, maybe we can artificially induce that exact same process to help people who have lost their vision.
And the technology they've created based on this idea is just incredible. Baccarita developed a device called the Brain Port. It uses a small video camera mounted on a pair of sunglasses.
Okay.
The camera translates the visual feed into electrical impulses. Those impulses are sent to a small pad containing hundreds of tiny electrodes, which the user places directly on their tongue.
Oh, wow. The tongue is actually highly conductive and densely packed with tactile receptors, which makes it an incredibly sensitive data receiver.
But wait, how does feeling a shock on your tongue translate to vision? Are they just feeling a buzz and guessing where things are?
No, not at all. The spatial dimensions of the camera's image are mapped directly to the grid of electrodes. So a shape in the camera's view becomes a tingling shape on the tongue.
That is fascinating.
Right. Over time, the tactile receptors send that spatial data up to the brain, and the visual cortex begins to decode it. Blind users can actually navigate entire physical obstacle courses just by processing the tingling geometry on their tongue.
That's mind-blowing. And then you have Peter Meisner's system called the Voice, which uses audio instead of touch. It takes the pixels from a camera feed and translates them into a complex, sweeping soundscape.
So turning images into sounds.
Yes. Bright pixels are translated as loud sounds. Pixels positioned high up in the physical image are translated as high-pitched sounds. It continuously scans the image from left to right, playing this chaotic symphony of hisses, beeps, and screeches that represent the visual world.
Wow.
There is a fascinating case study about a woman named Pat Fletcher who is completely blind. She trained with the voice system, and one day she stepped out of her bedroom and realized she could see the blinds hanging in her hallway.
Wait, really?
Yeah. She wasn't using her eyes. Her brain was taking the panning electronic squawks from the headset and actively rendering them into a physical visual map of the space in front of her. So what does this all mean?
What's your take?
It's exactly like a highly adaptable computer monitor. If the video cable, which is your eyes, is broken and can't receive the signal, you can just plug the data into the audio jack or the USB port, your ears or your tongue. The computer, your brain, is smart enough to decode the spatial data and show you the picture anyway.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is the ultimate proof of neuroplasticity. The fundamental takeaway here is that your brain is locked in a dark, silent vault inside your skull.
Right.
It has never actually seen light or heard a sound. It only receives electrical impulses. And it doesn't actually care how that electrical information enters the vault.
It really doesn't.
It doesn't care if the data comes from a retina, an eardrum, or a grid of electrodes on the tongue. It simply seeks spatial and temporal patterns in the electrical data it receives, and it builds your reality out of whatever sensory input is available.
So we have journeyed all the way from the cross-wired brains of people who literally see the physical color of a C chord
Huh?
to understanding how that very same biological trait shaped the brilliant, colorful music of legendary artists.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
We've traced the mechanisms down to the specific axonogenesis genes on chromosomes 2 and 6 and seen how that neurological architecture is inspiring technology that allows the blind to navigate hallways through sweeping soundscapes and tactile feedback.
It really forces you to reconsider your own daily experience. Your perception of reality is entirely constructed by the silent vault of your brain.
Definitely.
The next time you listen to music, notice how you inherently associate those high, piercing synthesizer pitches with brightness and the heavy, budding bass with darkness. The boundaries between your own senses are much blurrier than you probably think.
It really makes you wonder what's next. If technology is already allowing blind individuals to literally see spatial geometry through sound using a camera and a pair of headphones, and if our brains are truly this incredibly plastic, what happens when we take it a step further?
Or the possibilities are endless.
Could future humans use neural implants to artificially engineer entirely new forms of synesthesia? Could we eventually plug in a sensor that allows us to physically feel the pull of the Earth's magnetic field? Or translate a telescope's data stream so we can literally taste the chemical composition of a distant star? We'll leave you to mull that one over.
I love that.
But the next time you hear an elevator bell, just ask yourself, wait, what if it really is magenta? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll catch you next time.